not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. What's up, everyone? This video will be a detailed look at the trigger system on this Staccato HD P4.5. This pistol is on loan to me from my buddy Jeff at the Weapon Collective. He sent it to me to do trigger work on it and is allowing me to make content with it. Huge shout out to him. Link to his channel's in the description. Go over there, check it out, subscribe if you haven't. I just put out a video showing a complete disassembly and reassembly of this pistol. If you're curious, link to that is in the description as well. What I have planned for this one is first a look at the theory and operation of the Series 80 firing pin block system. I'll talk about how the inclusion of this safety system may affect trigger action. I will then try to determine which parts of the ignition system are proprietary and not. We'll take a look at the factory trigger action with the bent factory disconnector and how that damaged part may be affecting things. I identified this bent disconnector in the previous video. Then I will fit and install a new disconnector and see if that improves things at all. We'll look at the firing pin safety block spring and some possible replacement options and how that may affect trigger action. I will be inspecting and analyzing the sear and hammer geometry and engagement relationship like I normally do, taking pictures through a microscope and uploading them into calibrated image analyzing software to take measurements. I'll show how I modify the geometry of those components if I decide to do that. I will show how I go about polishing the whole trigger and firing pin block safety system. I'll show the sear spring adjustment, and I plan on adding an overtravel adjustment screw to the trigger shoe. And finally, I will cover the trigger action and weight after my improvements and adjustments. Timestamps are provided as always, so you can just skip to the end and see the results if you don't want all the nitty-gritty details. Lots to cover in this one, so let's get into it. The Series 80 trigger system was introduced by Colt in the early 1980s and adds a firing pin block that is actuated through a system of levers by the trigger bow. There was another firing pin block system Colt introduced before this, way back in the 1930s. The Schwartz safety system. The firing pin block is actuated by the grip safety. In contemporary pistols, you will see this in Kimber models with a 2 in the name, like the Custom 2. There are 4 extra parts in the 80 series trigger system. This lever on the sear pin, this lever on the hammer pin, the firing pin block plunger, and the spring. The 80 series firing pin needs this scallop here for the block. This is a common feature on most modern firing pins, so they will work in a Series 70 or 80 pistol. The extractor, if it's a traditional internal extractor, needs a cutout for it as well. This pistol has an external extractor, so that's not applicable here. The firing pin stop plate is different. It has an extra little cut here to clear the lever sticking up next to the disconnector. Between standard Series 70 and 80 1911s, the sear is the same, the hammer is the same, except it may have a flat ledge instead of a hook for the safety catch. As far as I know, the hammer and sear pins are the same. Of course, the slide and frame need to be machined for the extra components. I'm not going to cover the operation of the standard 1911 70 series trigger system. I have made a video demonstrating this. Link is in the description. When you pull the trigger, this lever contacting the back of the trigger bow is pivoted this way, which pivots this lever, and that pushes the firing pin block up against spring force and disengages it, which allows the firing pin to go all the way forward, igniting the round. The firing pin block spring is being compressed through the whole take-up of the trigger to the wall and through the wall and the brake. So this increases the weight of the take-up and the brake of the trigger. In a 70 series trigger system, the reset is controlled by the middle sear spring tang. That pushes the trigger bow back forward via the disconnector. In the Series 80 system, now we have the spring pushing the firing pin block down into this lever, which is pivoting this lever into the back of the trigger bow and also pushing it forward. Before getting into this, I want to make it clear that I do not have confirmation from Staccato about any of this. Therefore, I cannot be 100% certain which parts are proprietary versus standard 1911 in this pistol. I took measurements of all of these ignition components and compared them to diagrams I trust and standard 1911 parts I have lying around from reputable manufacturers. While I'm quite confident that is much different than having direct confirmation from the manufacturer of this pistol. All right, in terms of the ignition components in the slide, the firing pin spring appears to be standard. The Staccato firing pin appears to be standard. The firing pin retaining plate appears to be a standard 80 series one that is cut for a adjustable sight. In terms of mainspring housing components, the spring is proprietary. The plunger that interacts with the hammer strut is proprietary. The bottom plunger keeper, whatever you want to call it, is proprietary. The Staccato mainspring keeper pin is longer than a standard one by quite a bit, so I'm going to call that proprietary. Staccato Sear spring, standard Colt Sear spring. So the Sear spring is looking like it is standard 1911. I mentioned in the previous video, I already measured this thing up and it appears to be close enough to a standard 1911 disconnector, as far as I can tell with how bent and poorly machined it is. The hammer and sear pin appear to be standard 1911. The hammer strut is a typical Staccato titanium hammer strut, appears to be standard 1911. The hammer and sear both appear to be standard 1911. This trigger and trigger bow are definitely proprietary. For this video, I bought a set of standard 80 series firing pin safety internals. I will be swapping out the firing pin block spring. Standard plunger won't even fit in the slide. But there are enough slight differences in the geometry of these levers that I wouldn't want to install the standard 80 series components in this pistol. That would likely affect the timing of when the firing pin block is disengaged. I don't think it would necessarily create a dangerous condition where the firing pin block is completely disabled. Rather, I think it may result in the block not being fully disengaged when the hammer falls, leading to light strikes or no ignition. Let's take a look at the factory trigger action and weight. This is with the bent disconnector in the pistol. Please keep in mind, I am absolutely a trigger snob when it comes to 1911s. Also, what makes the trigger in a pistol good or bad is largely subjective. This trigger has quite a bit of up and down play in it. That does not feel good. It has side-to-side play this way as well. A little bit of it, that's not necessarily abnormal. Take-up is smooth, but it's heavy. It's not very long. The take-up weight is, it's about 2.5 pounds. This trigger's breaking right around 3.5 pounds. I'm going to try to control the trigger with my other finger here, but there's quite a bit of creep to the brake as well. And then about 1 millimeter of overtravel. Reset's a little bit long due to this, but it's really not terrible. This reset is, it's positive in a way that it pushes your finger back out. There's enough return force. However, the click of the reset is quiet and I can barely feel it in my finger. I really do not like this trigger action. The really heavy take up and then the brake that's only 1 pound more than that feels backwards to me for a 3.5 pound trigger. I want my take up to be about 1.5 pounds and then my brake to be 2 more pounds to get me to that 3.5. In my opinion, a 3.5 pound trigger is a good weight for a general use 1911, but not necessarily a duty oriented 1911. How might this bent disconnector be affecting the trigger action? Well, it's bent where it goes through the center of the sear. It's not binding, but I can certainly feel some extra resistance in there. So anytime the disconnector is moving separately from the sear, there will be more friction than if it weren't bent. During the take-up, the sear is stationary and the disconnector is moving backwards in the center of it, so extra friction here could be increasing take-up weight. From the wall through the brake, the sear pivots slightly about the disconnector as the disconnector paddle continues to travel rearward. However, the difference in movement is minimal. I wouldn't expect brake weight to be increased significantly due to this. During the reset, the sear is once again stationary, holding the hammer in the cocked position, and the disconnector comes forward and pops in front of the Sear legs. I would expect the extra friction to reduce reset positivity in this case. New disconnector is installed. I got an Extreme Engineering disconnector through Dawson Precision. It dropped right in, no modifications necessary. So let's see if that changed the trigger action at all. Yeah, that reset feels better. More positive, more audible, more tactile. See if it changed the weight at all. Take up, still 2.5 pounds. Break weight, still right around 3.5. If you have one of these pistols, I would really recommend checking your disconnector, especially if you're, perceiving that maybe the reset of your trigger feels a little shitty. I will link to this Extreme Engineering one through the Dawson Precision site. This one dropped right in for me. Presumably it would in your pistol as well. The concern I have with the bent or damaged disconnector in this pistol is that while this one is operating fine and doesn't pose any safety hazards, it just makes the trigger feel worse. A disconnector that's bent or badly damaged enough, and depending on how it interacts with the rest of the ignition components in the pistol, could absolutely lead to a dangerous situation. So please, if you have one of these pistols, check your disconnector. If you're not comfortable taking this apart and checking your disconnector, maybe pester Staccato about it. If this is a known issue and damaged or bent disconnectors got into multiple pistols, they need to do something about it. Before looking at this firing pin block spring, I want to mention that you can just disable this system. There are plates that are sold to take up the space that's left when you take the actuation levers out. You don't even have to do that. You can just take the plunger and spring out. I'll show that in a moment. But if you wanted to disable the firing pin block on this pistol, why did you buy it in the first place? That's one of its main selling points. The factory firing pin block spring in this pistol is heavy. I would be really limited in what I could do to the weight of the trigger if I don't swap this out. A very rough estimate of the spring rate is about 12 pounds per inch. I bought some McMaster springs, 4, 5, 8.5, and 11 pound per inch rates. The OD of these springs I ordered from McMaster couldn't be bigger than the counterbore in this plunger, which is 135 thousandths. I bought a Wolff Factory Series 80 spring. I estimate the Wolff spring is about 2 pounds per inch. None of these springs were the correct length. They all needed to be trimmed. Since the 80 series spring was so light, I left it as long as possible while ensuring the coils wouldn't close when the plunger was fully depressed. About 2 coils came off for a free length of 350 thousandths of an inch. I cut all the McMaster springs to about the same length as the factory one, which is 225 thousandths. What happens if we just take the plunger and spring out, disabling the firing pin block system? The take-up is now 1 pound, and the break is 2 1/4. I tested the rest of the springs. Here are the results. The take-up and break weight with the 11 pound spring makes me think my guess of 12 pounds per inch for the factory one was pretty close. I will be installing the cut-down standard Series 80 spring. It will give me the most freedom with the Sear spring adjustment. I did install the cut end of the spring down towards the plunger. I can still see that I'm getting positive firing pin safety block action. I have likely reduced the margin of safety on this firing pin block system, but I wouldn't be worried about it no longer being drop safe. I think the 4 and 5 pound McMaster springs would be good alternatives if you're looking to reduce the trigger weight a little bit, but still keep more of a positive firing pin block action. I'll put the McMaster and Wolff spring part numbers in the description. Before I look at the Sear and hammer geometry, I have a selection of gauge pins, and I find the ones that fit tightest in the frame pinholes. That way I can measure my frame, hammer, and Sear pin spacing to make sure it's within spec. This one is good. If I'm cutting new Sear faces, which I will be in this case, I also measure my Sear tip length to make sure I won't cut it too short. This one is plenty long. If you're interested in my tooling and how I set up my Sear and hammer geometry and engagement relationship, I'll link to a couple videos in the description. I look at the components in my Sear jig under a microscope, but I also use these extended pins with little 3D printed spacers for the wide body 1911 frames to make sure that what I'm seeing in my jig is close to what's going on in the pistol. Of course, looking at the Sear and hammer outside the frame like this is not a perfect representation of what's going on in here, but it's a good gut check. Based on my calibration slide and how I use this software, I believe my measurement accuracy is about plus or minus 1 thou, so keep that in mind moving forward. Also keep in mind that we are getting way into nitpicky trigger snob shit here. The first thing I notice is how rounded off the corner is between the primary and secondary Sear face. That is supposed to be like a 1 thou, 2 thou edge break for a clean release of the hammer. This Sear does appear to have the standard ordnance primary face angle, that is 90 degrees with respect to a line drawn through the axis of the Sear pin hole. The primary Sear face is about 20 thou. It's hard to measure with the large radii on either side. I generally see mine come out between 20 to 25 thou based on how the secondary angle is cut to adjust engagement depth. The hammer hooks are 90 degrees and about 24 thou long. That's on the long side. I like them to be 20 thou. In terms of engagement angle, it's hard to measure in the software. Accuracy is maybe plus or minus 2 degrees. I don't really bother anymore. I feel like I have a decent eye for this now, and this looks typical for a standard ordnance Sear primary face angle coming together with 90-degree hammer hooks. This is a negative relationship. Using the definition I prefer, that is, the Sear face falls away from the hammer hooks as it pivots forward. I like to cut my primary Sear face more positive, so the Sear slightly lifts the hammer as it pivots forward. This gives me more positive engagement and allows me to reduce my engagement depth for a crisper break. That's just my preference for 1911 trigger feel. There's about 16 thousandths of engagement depth in this case. I target 10 to 15 depending on the trigger break weight. I think 16 thou engagement makes sense for this trigger job as it came from the factory. Since we had weight added to the brake from the heavy firing pin block spring being compressed, the preload on the left tang of the Sear spring was lowered quite a bit to get to that 3.5 pound brake weight. Less pressure on the Sear and hammer hook interface means we need more engagement depth to maintain a proper margin of safety. There's nothing here that is surprising to me other than the large radius between the primary and secondary Sear faces. This is all reasonable geometry otherwise, in my opinion. So what am I going to do to improve this? Well, I will cut my hammer hooks to 20 thou. I will cut a new primary Sear face a couple of degrees more positive, then reestablish a secondary face and adjust its depth and angle to get 12 thou of hammer hook engagement. Here's what that all looks like. Keep in mind, plus or minus a thou here. My Sear primary face came out to about 20 thou again. There's now a nice clean angle between the primary and secondary face with just a slight edge break. The hammer hooks are right around 20 thou. My engagement depth is around the 12 thou I wanted. Looking at the engagement angle, it looks a little more positive than before. I have calculated that 1/4 turn of the adjustment screw on my jig results in roughly a 2 to 3 degree change in face angle, so I gave it a 1/4 turn off of its existing angle. I have posted a very long video on how I polish firearm components. Links in the description. I'm not going to show the whole process here, just what components I polished and where. A note on the firing pin safety block. It appears to have maybe an electroless nickel coating, like nickel boron or nickel PTFE. If that's the case, I don't want to remove that, but I wanted to polish the surface of what is there. No power buffing wheel or polishing compound. This is a hand job with a cotton cloth and some fine lapping compound. Polished the primary face of my Sear there. The machining on the sides of the Sear, and the hammer for that matter, were pretty rough, so I run a stone over them to knock down high spots. I want minimal friction as it's pivoting in the frame. Same story with the hammer here, ran a stone over it, and you can see all the little tiny burrs that I took off around the edge of this thing. All those little shiny spots around the edge. Polished my hammer hooks. I reprofile the tip of the hammer strut and polish it. They come from Staccato looking like this, and this gouges into the mainspring plunger, so I turn them into a hemisphere and polish them. Polish the ends of the mainspring on the cut end right here. I run a stone over it to make sure there's no little burrs hanging out. The new disconnector from Extreme Engineering, really pretty good. I did a little bit of work on the face here, and then a little bit more polishing here and around here. full polish all the way around the trigger bow. This middle tang was already polished as it came from the factory. I did a little bit more and I polished the area right here that interacts with the back of the Sear leg. Then these levers really weren't bad, but I polished the sides a little bit more and then polished the surfaces where this one interacts with the back of the trigger bow and the other lever right here, and then where this one interacts with the lever below it and the firing pin plunger. And then anything that has a pinhole in it, I spin 1500 grit by hand just to make sure there's no high spots hanging out in those holes. I usually install a 17-pound mainspring with all my trigger jobs, which I can't do here because the proprietary one Staccato decided to use. I don't know what the weight of this one is. I have a bunch of mainsprings and I squished them all to compare. This felt most like the 19-pound mainspring. Can't confirm that obviously, but it felt lighter than the standard 23-pound one, that's for sure. I didn't bother to compare the amount of preload on the spring when installed in their respective mainspring housings. Anyways, I don't think this mainspring will cause me any issues in terms of brake weight adjustment. This is the level of assembly I leave it at for doing my Sear spring adjustments. Slide comes off, drop the hammer, push the pin through, pull the mainspring out, pull your Sear spring out, do your adjustment, reassemble, recheck. It was a little bit tricky, had to do it about 5 times, but I'm pleased with where I ended up. So now we are at a 1 3/4 pound take up. And I would have liked it to be closer to 1.5, but I like the feeling of the reset better with this adjustment. We're right at about 3 pounds on the brake now. I'm not going for like a crazy light race trigger here. The trigger action feels much better. It's much cleaner. The reset is very, very positive. So all that's left to do now is the final reassembly and then the over travel adjustment. This trigger did have a bit of over travel to it. It made the reset a little long. It really wasn't terrible, but in the interest of making this trigger as dirt nasty as possible, I added an over travel screw to the trigger shoe. The pre-travel distance felt about right to me. For odd shaped parts like this, I like to model up and 3D print myself some little jigs. It would be very hard to securely clamp this in a vise otherwise. Whichever tap drill I used, it wouldn't be long enough for my drill chuck to clear the back of the trigger bow. That means I had to do all the machining from the front. Also, the bow would be in the way of my tap and tap handle, so it also needed to be tapped from the front. I chose a M2.5 by 0.45 millimeter set screw. After I adjust these, I red Loctite the screws in place. I really don't want them moving. If it does need adjustment again for some reason, a little torch action will loosen them right up. But now this takes a little 1 millimeter hex key, so I'll include one of these in my return package to Jeff just in case. I did try to touch up the finish a little bit. I used this aluminum black stuff. It's kind of shit. It just rubs off. I don't know that it's any more effective than a Sharpie, but I went ahead and put some Caswell metal sealer on top of that, so it looks a little bit better, and hopefully it will stay like that. If anyone else wants to do this to their Staccato HD trigger, let me know, and I can post the step files for this trigger jig on my GrabCAD page. We've covered a lot in this video, so a reminder of what I've done. I installed a new and not bent disconnector. I installed a new firing pin block spring, a standard Series 80 spring. I cut about 2 coils off to a free length of 350 thousandths. I cut the hammer hook shorter. I established new Sear geometry. I cut the primary face slightly more positive. This gave me more margin on Sear engagement so I could reduce engagement depth. I established a new secondary angle and barely broke the edge between the 2 faces. The hammer to Sear engagement was around 16 thousandths and now it's closer to 12. I polished all the components related to the ignition and firing pin block system. I adjusted the Sear spring to achieve a 1.75 pound take up and a 3 pound brake. I added an over travel adjustment screw to the trigger shoe and I adjusted out some of the over travel, which shortened up the reset. Here's what the new trigger action looks like. Take up, smooth, much lighter, nice firm wall, crisp brake, minimal over travel, very short positive reset. Try to control the trigger shoe here, see if we can get an idea of creep in the brake. It's a lot less than it was. It feels much better to me. I like a crisp brake. This is a pretty crisp brake. Now, of course, after doing any work like this, safety and function checks, try to push the hammer off the Sear, make sure the thumb safety works, and then my final test for Sear engagement. Drop the slide on an empty chamber, and the hammer better not fall to its half-cock notch. This trigger turned out quite nice. I don't think I could tell it's a Series 80 if I didn't know that and you just handed me the pistol and said it's a 1911. I have it set up based on my preferences, but Jeff told me I have his permission to do whatever I want with this trigger. I think he'll be pleased with the results. This is just a Series 80 trigger system. There's nothing new here. There's nothing surprising. I did a trigger job on this like I do on every 1911, except I polished a few extra parts and replaced a spring. Adding an overtravel adjustment screw is a little out of the norm, but I would guess with time, aftermarket trigger solutions will pop up for this pistol. I hope this video was entertaining, informative, or helpful in some way. I hope I have adequately shown what kind of improvements can be made to the Staccato HD trigger. Series 80 1911 triggers can be pretty nice. Oh, and a reminder to check your disconnector if you have one of these. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.